Hello, everyone. Hi, Jill. Nice to have you with me today on this Ash Wednesday when we're sending this out. It's an important day on the Christian calendar. It's a day, yes, of looking forward, hopefully, to the death and resurrection and all that entails. But it's a time of sobriety, a time of lament and repentance. And we just had at our church last Sunday, for those of you who are watching this that weren't there, we had a Black History Month commemorative Sunday where we had a powerful guest speaker come in and kind of did a deep dive in the reality of historically and currently of systemic racism in our country and globally. And we just wanted to sort of extend that conversation. Thanks to you, Jill, for coming to share a little bit. You're taking an anti-racism course currently through Western University, and one of the many resources that you've encountered, I know, really struck a chord with you. And so you've prepared to share a transcript this morning from a video called "We Are All Treaty People," and we'll put the link to that entire video um, in the show notes today. But I want to just turn it over to you. Maybe you can share why you found this to be so powerful, and then just read this transcript of Indigenous voices and conversations with us today as part of our Ash Wednesday reflections. So thanks, Jill. I'll just turn it over to you to share whatever's on your heart and to share this with us.
Okay, well, this video was the some Indigenous people speaking about how they've been impacted by racism in Canada and by the history of racism in Canada. So I just thought that I would get a transcript, part of a transcript of some of the things that people that were being interviewed were saying in the video. We are all treaty people.
I'd love to have you share that with us. Why don't you go ahead and share from the transcript?
Okay. For over a century, the central goals of Canada's Aboriginal policy were to eliminate Aboriginal government, ignore Aboriginal rights, terminate the treaties, and through a process of assimilation, cause Aboriginal peoples to cease to exist as distinct legal, social, cultural, religious, and racial entities in Canada. So assimilation is that policy of those colonizers who are essentially attempting to eradicate the Indigenous identity. The establishment and operation of residential schools were central elements of this policy, which can best be described as cultural genocide. It was a process in which our cultures as Indigenous peoples were denied, were condemned, where legal structures were put up to destroy our practices, where our spiritual objects were destroyed. That is cultural genocide. It impacted our dignity and our identity. Who am I if I can't live out of the culture that has been given to me? So, what the residential schools did was create a structure that was in place to get rid of Indigenous ways of understanding the purpose of life and the Creator, and what our broader values are as human beings and our connection to all creation. And I mentioned that colonization is a structure, and in the structure of residential schools, you see this assimilation practice that is trying to get rid of the distinctive otherness of Indigenous peoples, which we now know has extremely negative effects on not only individual Indigenous people, but on entire families and communities and nations. As those traditional families break down, our traditional social structures are being broken down by this deliberate attempt by church and state to replace with the Western identities. In 1894, the federal government put in place regulations relating to mandatory residential school attendance. With a warrant, one could enter by force, if need be, any house, building, or place named in the warrant and remove the child. The grief that I carry, this is about separation, being separated from my mom and dad, my brothers and sisters. In justifying the government's residential school policy, Canada's first Prime Minister, Sir John A. Macdonald, told the House of Commons in 1883, "When the school is on the reserve, the child lives with its parents who are savages. He is surrounded by savages. And though he may learn to read and write, his habits and training and motives are Indian. He is simply a savage who can read and write. It has been strongly pressed on myself, as the head of the department, that Indian children should be withdrawn as much as possible from the parental influence. And the only way to do that would be to put them in central training industrial schools where they will acquire the habits and modes of, of thought of white men. And finally, this author was speaking, Daniel and Paul, who wrote a book, We Were Not the Savages. The title of my book is We Were Not the Savages, and the reason for the title of the book is simply put, that the Mi'kmaq were civilized people who treated their own people with respect and dignity. In opposition, the Mi'kmaq were East Coast tribe, I think. In opposition, when you're looking at the civilization of England at that point in time, it was more based on terrorism. When you're looking at history, have a look at European history. And at that point in time, the English, for instance, were still burning people at the stake and chopping people's heads off and putting them on spikes to terrorize the population into submission. So when you're looking at the overall history of Europe, in particular 1492, you're looking at people who were, I guess, practicing barbarity across the line. And so when we look at the history of the Mi'kmaq, for instance, the Mi'kmaq were very peaceful people. And also indigenous people of the Americans weren't traveling around the world, destroying civilizations and claiming the wealth of other people for their own.
Thank you, Jill. That's a sobering reminder of our dark history here in Canada on this Ash Wednesday, synonymous with the putting of ashes on our foreheads in the shape of the cross. The cross, sadly, for many in the Indigenous community historically, the cross has been misused and abused as a symbol of power and of colonialism. But the cross quintessentially is the self-sacrificial love of God, the love of God who enters into our human condition, God who experiences pain, abandonment, and who stands in solidarity with the wounded, with the marginalized. In my studies, I've been reading a book recently and interacting with called The Wounded Heart of God. And it's really opened my eyes more deeply to the reality that God is not distant nor absent. God is very much real and close and not without emotion or feeling. God's heart is wounded when we dehumanize and wound any of God's good creation. And so on this Ash Wednesday, thank you, Jill, with those reflections in mind. I pray that we will all take some time today and throughout these next 40 days of this Lenten season to evaluate how we can more intentionally listen, learn, empathize, stand in solidarity, and work for peace and unity and healing in our culture. And that is God's desire, and that is God's will. And so on this Ash Wednesday, take some time to do that. And I hope this little meditation and this reading from Jill will help us as we begin this season of Lent.